Hello everyone. Now, let's discuss the PMP exam 7th edition syllabus. In this edition, it's structured around people, processes, and business environment. These three dimensions determine the scoring. Regarding the process domain, it accounts for half of the exam, 50% or 90 questions. Now that we've covered resources and communication, stakeholders, scope, schedule, cost, and quality, as well as integration, risk, and procurement. Now that we've covered these topics, let's move on to the process section. Its key components. You'll find most of it quite straightforward, with only a few tricky parts. We'll cover those in the Agile section later. Let's explore this process section. It encompasses integration and scope, timeline, budget, and quality, resources, communication, risk, procurement, stakeholders, and more, covering initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, and closure. There's always a bit more to it. It extends beyond the 10 knowledge areas and 5 core processes. It's then supplemented by Agile practices and the Agile phase framework. Let's examine this together. The first key process-related task is executing projects with urgency to deliver business value. A crucial concept here is business value. All actions must deliver business value. This approach makes the project worthwhile. Let's start with the project itself. It must deliver business value. The project must be worthwhile. During project execution, as we'll see in Agile methodology, we break down features into smaller tasks and prioritize them by business value. With this prioritization in place, we focus on high-value tasks first. This process continues iteratively. The first step, assess opportunities to incrementally deliver value. Incremental delivery is a key concept in Agile methodology. It means we don't need to finish everything before delivering to the client. Instead, we deliver useful features to the client first. Then we make incremental deliveries, followed by more incremental deliveries. So it's about assessing opportunities for incremental delivery, enabling continuous delivery. Second, evaluate the project's overall business value. Ensure the entire project is worthwhile, and assess the value of each deliverable. It's definitely a worthwhile endeavor. Third, the team breaks down project tasks as needed to identify the minimum viable product, or MVP. This concept is also a key part of Agile methodology. When dealing with multiple project components, we don't need to finish everything before delivery. Instead, we start with a minimum viable product, or MVP for short. We develop an MVP first to assess its value and usefulness to the client. Then we build upon it, adding features and enhancements. This approach focuses on incremental delivery, iterative product delivery, then the idea of continuous MVP delivery. The real focus is on business value. So, prioritize based on business value urgency. This urgency translates to structured prioritization. Alright. Execute projects in order of business value. The second task is communication management. If you're familiar with communication management, this will be easy to understand. Start by analyzing all stakeholders and their specific communication requirements. When do they require the information? What specific details are required? How should we deliver it? And so forth. After identifying these communication needs, we can develop a communication management plan. Makes sense. It's basically a roadmap for communication. Next, we define stakeholder communication methods. This includes channels, frequency, and depth. Essentially, we're taking those communication needs and breaking them down into specifics. Channels, frequency, and level of detail. Now, the third point covers effective project communication and updates. This basically means identifying communication requirements. It's about drafting a communication strategy. This involves putting the communication plan into action and overseeing the communication process. Okay, on to the final point. Evaluating communication effectiveness and gathering feedback. This means monitoring the communication process and its effectiveness. So you'll notice that within this entire framework, the communication component is nearly identical to the communication aspect in the 10 knowledge areas we've discussed in project management. Alright, let's move on to the third point. The third task, risk assessment and management. It's about developing a scientific risk management approach. This involves strategizing, iterative assessment, and prioritization. First off, risks are inevitable in project management. When risks emerge, we need to come up with strategies to tackle them head-on. In the overall risk management process, we start by identifying risks, followed by qualitative analysis. Rank the identified risks, followed by quantitative analysis, to gain deeper insights into the risks. Next, develop risk response strategies and implement them. Finally, monitor the risks. This entire process constitutes what we call systematic risk management. These scientific approaches to risk management encompass all these steps. Moving on to the next point. We have iterative assessment and prioritization. Iterative evaluation is, in essence, an ongoing process. Risk monitoring is a key component of our overall risk management. This approach emphasizes the need for ongoing project risk surveillance. We must identify any emerging risks and reassess the relevance of existing ones. This continuous cycle defines the iterative process. Prioritization, another crucial aspect, is integral to our qualitative risk analysis. It involves rating risks based on their importance. In summary, this third task encompasses these critical elements. This aligns perfectly with our risk management approach. Let's move on to task 4, which is stakeholder engagement. In essence, it's about getting stakeholders involved to enhance their support for the project and minimize any potential resistance. Let's start with the first step, stakeholder analysis. This includes assessing their authority, interests, and influence on the project. Then we'll map out their power and interests, using tools like grids and matrices, to analyze these stakeholders, their position in the project, their influence and rights in the project, and their characteristics. This allows us to effectively categorize the stakeholders, which brings us to our second point, stakeholder classification. Stakeholders in this category require our focused management, while those in another category. What's our approach? How does this dimension fit in? You see, categorize stakeholder engagement. In other words, using your classification system, for each stakeholder group, we have our own strategies and tactics for effective management. Lastly, create and implement stakeholder engagement plans. Basically, this means we put our stakeholder strategies into action. If we spot any weaknesses, we adjust accordingly. This aligns perfectly with stakeholder management in our 10 knowledge areas. Next up is a section on planning and managing budget and resources. This covers our cost management. It also considers our resource management. Let's check it out. Naturally, we'll focus on cost management. Now, first, we consider the project scope and draw from past projects to apply lessons learned to estimate project resource needs. In other words, we determine what types of resources and how much we need. Okay, in resource management, we cover this in another section where we estimate resources. Got it. Next up, future budget forecasting challenges. These budgeting challenges involve estimating our budget needs and identifying potential risks. For these risks, we need to calculate additional costs to build a financial buffer or to tap into budget reserves. This is our approach for future planning, to create a projected budget for these measures. Next point, track project budget variances. If needed, adhere to governance procedures to make adjustments. This involves using methods such as stakeholder analysis and other similar techniques to monitor the project and determine if we're over or under budget. In case of a budget overrun, what steps should we take to address it effectively? We might need to tap into our contingency reserves or draw from management reserves. This may require submitting formal requests. These are our cost control measures. Okay, moving on to the next point, planning and managing resources. This falls under our resource management strategy. We've estimated our resource requirements. So, how can we best leverage our resources? How do we cultivate a strong team and foster teamwork? How can we maximize our team's potential to achieve our goals? This approach considers both cost and resource management aspects. Now, let's discuss planning and progress management. As you can see, the emphasis here is on progress management. It starts by stating that estimating project tasks. Basically, it's about estimating the amount of functionality. Once we've done that, we can estimate the time frame. We can list out the key milestones. Then we look at how they depend on each other and on external factors. We sort out all these relationships. We also consider story points. We'll cover story points in the Agile management section later in more detail. It's basically a measure of functionality. Using this information, now let's look at the second point. We use benchmarking and historical data to make estimations. What kind of estimations? Comparative estimation and parameter-based estimation. That's the gist of it. You see, we're using historical data to make comparative estimates. With a wealth of historical data, we can develop parametric models for making estimates. Using this data, along with tools like schedule network diagrams and estimation results, we can draft a project schedule. This methodical approach helps us create a detailed timeline. Next, we track the progress and monitor its execution. This systematic approach allows us to assessing project progress. You'll also notice that in our analysis and management of political affairs, we can similarly calculate if we're falling behind schedule or ahead of it, and how much time remains to finish. It covers all these aspects. That's why we develop a schedule to monitor and control progress in schedule planning and management. We also use a methodology-based approach as needed. Let's talk about revising the project schedule. During our monitoring phase, if we notice significant delays, we might need to adjust our original schedule accordingly. This is also part of schedule control. Now, for the final point, integrating with other projects and operations. While managing the schedule, we need to take an integrated approach to achieve common objectives. This means coordinating various work streams. Okay, let's talk about schedule management. We've covered cost, resources, and scheduling. Now, let's move on to quality. Task 7. Planning and managing product quality and deliverables. Alright. So, we need to focus on effective quality management. The first step is to identify the project deliverables and establish their quality standards. This brings us back to what we discussed at the beginning. When developing a quality management plan, we include quality standards. Next, we identify quality discrepancies and suggest improvements. To do this, start with quality control. This helps spot quality issues and develop solutions. This process is quality control. Okay, that's quality control. Finally, the last point mentions continuous monitoring of project deliverable quality throughout this process. If we're talking about ongoing management, we're referring to quality management. This includes planning quality management, controlling quality, and managing quality. All these aspects align with our quality management knowledge area. Alright, let's look at the 8th point. Planning and managing scope. Everything boils down to scope. Whether we're calculating workload, quality, or resources, it all comes back to scope. In scope planning and management, the first step is to identify requirements and prioritize them. In other words, we gather information from the client about the project requirements. Then we prioritize these requirements, identifying the most important ones, followed by the less critical ones. Based on these requirements, we define the project scope and break it down into smaller parts. Why do we break down the scope? Because by dividing it into smaller, manageable parts, it becomes easier to manage and oversee. It simplifies management and tracking. That's why we break it down. For instance, creating a work breakdown structure. Another term we use is backlog, or the 班师想 in Chinese. This concept is central to Agile methodology. In Scrum, a popular Agile framework, we use what's called a product backlog, a prioritized list of features. Product backlog. There's also the sprint backlog, which contains tasks for the current sprint. We'll dive deeper into these Agile concepts later. Okay, let's continue. Next up is scope monitoring and validation. Scope validation is essentially the acceptance process. We also need to monitor the scope. This involves tracking scope changes. We must follow the change management process. Therefore, Task 8 essentially covers scope management. Now, let's look at Task 9. It's about integrating project planning activities. There's a key point here. You should be aware of this. You'll notice that he broke down the entire integration management process into several key components. One component is integration planning. Another is change management, which is also part of integration management. It involves real-time monitoring and control of changes. Next is project work management. This refers to the execution phase. It's the execution aspect of integration management. Another component is knowledge transfer, which is also part of integration management. This involves project knowledge management. Next, let's discuss project planning and management. This includes project closure and handover processes. It's about wrapping up projects or phases. You'll notice that integration is a part of various project tasks. Let's examine this together. Starting with the first point, integrated project planning activities. As we know, planning is about strategizing. But it covers plans for all project aspects. The first point mentions that we need to enhance the project planning or reinforce phase-specific plans. As we're well aware, preparation brings success while negligence leads to failure. Without a solid plan, the project may fall apart, lacking any foundation or direction to follow. Next, we need to consider dependencies, gaps, and ongoing business value. When assessing the integrated project plan, let's start by getting to grips with the project management plan. It's an all-encompassing blueprint. This plan incorporates scope management, requirements management, schedule management, cost management, responsibility management, and more. We're talking about a dozen or so plans in total. So, what's crucial here is, first, grasping why this plan matters so much. Then, we need to actually develop the plan and assess the plan's effectiveness to determine if it's still viable. Later, when monitoring the plan, the process is similar. We obtain results and compare them to the plan to see if adjustments are necessary. This is based on external factors that influence the plan and its real-world performance. Okay, next step, analyzing collected data. Why collect data? More often than not, we gather information to aid decision-making. That's why it's mentioned. Gather and analyze data for smart project choices. What goes into these decisions? Should we revise our plan? Do we need to adjust? Should we request more resources? or request deadline extensions, among other options. Essentially, this is part of our monitoring process. Alright. Next point is identify key information requirements. In other words, to successfully execute this project, we must determine which information is crucial and what we need to closely monitor and understand. Right. This integrates into our overall project planning.